Hi, I'm Jolene and I'm here with Barbara to talk about working with cancer. I'm a member of the Trekstock network and I also work part-time.
And I'm Barbara Wilson and I'm founder and director of Working with Cancer. For many years I was an HR director in the city and got cancer 10 years ago now, and my experience led me to set up the company, and it's good to share my experience and knowledge with you today.
Okay, so the first question. If I'm unable to work, what statutory sick pay or company sick pay is available to me?
Okay, well, I'm not a greatest expert on sick pay, but basically there are two forms of sick pay available. If you're working, you may find you've got company sick pay. If you're not getting company sick pay, and that will be in your contract, then you're entitled to something called statutory sick pay, which you can get for 28 weeks. And you need to have worked for a few days with your employer. It's just over £88 a week, and so you're entitled to that for 28 weeks. You can get it from, I think it's the 4th day of your sickness.
Okay, interesting. How do I speak to my manager or boss about my needs to have a phased return to work?
Always difficult speaking to people about your cancer and a phased return. The best thing to do is to talk to them about 3 or 4 weeks before you're due to come back. And that should be a conversation, if possible, face to face. So if you're well enough to go into the office, or if they can come home to you, you sit down and talk about what hours you want to do, what duties you're able to do, hours of work generally. But a few weeks before you're due to return. No surprises.
Okay, and following on from that, the next question is, who do I speak to if HR are not being helpful and not listening to me?
Frankly, all the evidence shows that the person who can make the biggest difference to having a successful return to work is your line manager. So if your line manager's on your side, that can be an enormous help. If your line manager isn't on your side, that can make life very tough. But if HR aren't being helpful, your line manager is the person who can talk to them on your behalf, or just ease kind of conversations around sick pay and hours off and so forth. Okay. So try them.
Do you think it would be helpful to perhaps organise a meeting with a member of HR and a line manager in order to discuss all together?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea actually, because very often the line manager may want to help but doesn't know all the rules. Mm-hmm. And the HR person might know all the rules, but may be relatively inflexible.
Okay.
So the two together is often the best combination.
Okay. The next question is, do I have to take annual leave to attend appointments?
No. Maybe I should just say something about the Equality Act.
Yeah.
And there's a very good booklet called Your Rights at Work, published by Macmillan. You can download it as a PDF from Macmillan's website or from my website under useful links. And basically the Equality Act gives you a whole load of protections at work, and you're covered by it forever. Okay, so from the point of diagnosis, for the rest of your life, however ill or well you are, you will always be covered by it.
Okay.
And it means that you're protected in having what's called reasonable adjustments that allow you to have things like a phased return to work. Mm-hmm. It also allows you time off to have medical appointments. A good employer, a nice employer, will pay you for that time off. Maybe a less nice employer won't pay you, but you don't have to take your leave. You're allowed to have that time off.
Okay, good to know. The next question is, if I take time off, how do I ensure job security? So I guess following on from what we just said.
Well, in a sense, your job should be secure anyway. So you're protected against, for example, being made redundant because of you've had high sickness absence. You're protected, say, in recruitment, we can come on to that later, promotion, training, pay. Your employer should not take any negative action against you because of your cancer. And if they do, you have the right to raise a grievance, or if it really came to it, to take them to court. Okay. But the booklet, Your Rights at Work, sets that out all very clearly.
Okay. The next question is, how do I speak to my colleagues about cancer?
Well, the first thing is, do you want to speak to them? My view is it's always good to speak to people from the point that you're diagnosed, as we're all different people. We all have different reactions to cancer, and some people are very private and they don't want to go there. But if you can tell people a little bit, both your boss and HR and your colleagues in particular, they can provide the support you need. So it's really just a question of, screwing up the courage to tell them maybe individually or as a group, whatever works best for you, and to have a conversation. I do that rather than do an email.
Yeah, I personally have found it a lot easier at work, having been open with people that I work directly with, because you can kind of be yourself and not worry too much about, they'll think I'm miserable today. But actually, if they have an understanding about what you're going through, it becomes slightly easier.
Absolutely, and I think the problem is that sometimes if people don't know what your illness is or don't know what's going on, unfortunately, particularly if people don't know you that well, they can very quickly draw the wrong conclusions and make assumptions about you which are totally false, which doesn't help.
Yeah. The next question is, what expectation is there on your employer, and what expectation do they have on you?
Slightly kind of broad question. I mean, under the Equality Act, the employer is required to say, know about your situation as far as they can, and as far as you're able to tell them, and to make adjustments to support you during your illness. I would say, as an employee, I mean, you're not required to tell the employer anything. Let me just be clear about that. You can say absolutely nothing, but as we said earlier, if you do that, you won't get the help you need.
Yeah.
So I would say it's great if you can be open with them and tell them as much as you can in order to get the support you need.
Okay.
And maybe not to do silly things. So when you're returning to work, if you start saying to an employer, I want to come back for sort of like an hour on a Monday and an hour on a Wednesday, and I'll work through my lunch hour on Friday between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. I mean, that's kind of a bit ridiculous. So I think it's about both sides being reasonable, really.
Yeah. Okay. So perhaps, I guess, something like, just thinking about sort of my situation, to say, can I start the day slightly later because of rush hour on the tube? Things like that would be sort of a reasonable request.
Perfectly reasonable. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The next question is, if you're unable to do something, for example, a task due to particular limitations, I guess, in terms of treatment, how do you communicate or navigate this?
And that's the conversation you should have at various stages. I mean, for example, when you're having active treatment, if you're still working, then before you start your active treatment, if you've not had that conversation during treatment, it's important just to sit down with your employer and say, because of the impact of my treatment, I'm not able to do this task or do these hours, whatever it is that I hoped I'd be able to do. So on that basis, we need to make some adjustments. And it may be that you say, I can't do that any longer. I can't work through my treatment any longer. I'm going to have some time at home. But it's important to have that conversation. I say, if you can have it face to face with HR, that's the best situation you can have.
I guess also it depends on the type of task and the type of job you're in.
Totally.
So if I was in a job where I did a lot of manual handling, that might then be an issue to do a lot of manual handling.
Of course, yeah. So if you're doing heavy lifting or working outside, doing a big physical job, then you could ask for backroom work, or not to. You might have the time off as well. I think one of the things that employers tend not to understand is that there are over 200 different forms of cancer, loads of different forms of treatment for every type of cancer, and we're all different. Yeah. So we all respond to treatment in a different way, and they don't know what to expect, nor does the individual with cancer. So I think it's important to have the conversations that manages people's expectations, and also not to expect too much of yourself. I mean, we're often our own worst enemies in trying to go back to work too soon.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is, having been off work, the cancer has affected my desire for my life and I want to change my career. How do I go about doing this? Do you think it's better to return to work first?
Yes, but in your own time. So, not to be bullied into going back too soon. Unfortunately, doctors tend not to be terribly helpful because they often say, you go back when you're ready, and you never really know when you're ready. but I think you're protected at work. So trying to do a new job when you're still recovering and not at your best isn't terribly good. So if you can get back to work, gradually ease yourself back in. And feelings change. I think a classic side effect, if you could call it that, of cancer is maybe wanting to do something different with your life, because you have a chance to think differently about what's going on, and confronting your own mortality is a life-changing experience. So it's good to want to do something different. There's nothing bad with that, but you have to be at your best to go for interviews or to try something new.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say to anyone, ease yourself back into your job if you can, and then take your time to think through what's right for you and what kind of work you might want to do. There's no rush, take your time.
Okay. The next question is, what do I do about gaps in my CV due to my treatment and diagnosis?
Always really difficult. I could be slightly rude about my HR colleagues and say that many is the case they will go into an interview without actually having read the CV and won't have noticed the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
I actually wouldn't try and disguise them. I think I might possibly do a covering email that says I've been ill and we'll tell you a little bit more about that at interview, or potentially not say anything and talk about it at interview.
So you don't have to say anything.
You don't have to say anything. The one thing I would say is that lying on your CV is not a good idea at all, because what happens is most employers these days will take references.
Mm-hmm.
They will often use a third party to check up on your references. That be everything from where you've worked to your qualifications. And if they find you've been lying on your CV, they may well have withdrawn the offer.
Okay.
And they'll have a good reason to withdraw the offer. So making stuff up, I really wouldn't suggest you do that.
Okay. What is my previous employer allowed to say around my illness to my new employer?
Well, that's also a good question. I mean, normally when you leave a company, you can, for example, agree a reference before you leave. But fundamentally, an employer is bound by the Equality Act. If you left, for reasons of redundancy or you just resigned, whatever, they would normally these days only be, the proper thing is only just to state the dates that you will work there.
Mm-hmm.
And the classic phrase is, and we know no reason why you should not employ this person. If they start talking about your sickness, absence or your cancer without your agreement, then that is something that you could potentially, it's discrimination, and you could act against them. So, I mean, the best thing, if you've been off sick and you've left an employer under a settlement agreement or for particular reasons, the best thing to do is try and agree the reference, a written reference, as part of your agreement before you go.
Good to know.
And then the employer is bound to use that.
Okay. The next question is, what support should I expect or seek from HR department, which we've touched on.
We have. I mean, HR departments do vary in nature, but as a very basic thing, they should at least, at the outset when you've been diagnosed, give you information about sick pay, any counselling, any support services that will help you during your illness and recovery. So tell you about things like holidays and leave entitlements and all the services available, and then help to keep in touch with you while you're off sick. But they do vary in nature.
Okay, good to know. If I'm suffering from the long-term effects of cancer, am I entitled to ask for a change in working hours, or could I put my job at risk, which we've kind of touched on as well briefly before?
Yeah, you're allowed to ask. The right to have reasonable adjustments in your role, so that's hours, duties and so forth, continues for the rest of your working life. The point may come when an employer after a year or two says, I can no longer make these adjustments, Or they may say from the outset, these adjustments aren't reasonable from our perspective, we can't make them. But you have the right to request them and to be protected in the sense that you're requesting those changes from the moment you ask for them.
Yeah. And is there a sort of hard and fast rule in terms of, say, if you requested particular changes and then, say, 2 years down the line you think, oh, actually, I could now start work at 9 and leave at 5 rather than 10 till 4, are you then able to put that request in also?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things, if you're making any adjustments, then they should always be agreed to be a temporary nature with a review. So it might be, for example, that you say my return to work plan is that I will gradually, I'll work a day a week from 10 till 4 for the next 2 or 3 weeks. Then I'll up it to 2 days and then to 3 days. These are all temporary adjustments, and we'll review it after 6 months.
Yeah.
And it might be after 6 months you say, well, actually, I want this to continue for another year. Can we then review it?
Yeah.
But then there's no reason why during that period or afterwards you can't go back and say, I would like now to work full time. Okay. The issue will be whether the employer can accommodate that commercially, and they would need to give you a good reason for what they can or can't do.
Yeah, sure. The next question is there a general rule with regards to how little or how much information employers want to know about an employee's situation?
No. I mean, I think the issue really is that best practice would be for you and the employer to understand as much as you can tell them about your illness and treatment options, but you know as much as I do that things change.
Yeah.
So, you might start off with your doctor saying, your oncologist saying, we'll need X months of chemo, Y months of radiotherapy, so much surgery, and then halfway through they say, well, actually, we now need to do something else.
Yeah.
But I think, so there's no requirement for you to provide the employer with certain information. I mean, the employers are required to act like a good employer and to understand your circumstances and to provide you with the support that you need. But in terms of quantity of information, there's no kind of set rule, really. Okay.
And is there any sort of literature or anything you'd recommend that is useful for people that are looking to get back into work or start working again?
I think there are several things. I mean, the Macmillan toolkit is very good, and you can download the guide. I think it's called Work and Cancer. Again, either from the Macmillan website or from my website. I mean, it's just a very good basic factual information about what you can and can't do. There's also a very good book called The Cancer Survivor's Companion, which is particularly good. It's by Lucy Atkins and Dr. Frances Goodhart, and it's very good in describing something that's often overlooked by employers, which is the psychological impact of cancer and how that impacts people who might be physically recovered but worrying about things like scans and tests and recurrence. And it's got some great hints and tips, really practical stuff, both for the individual with cancer but also for employers and friends and family. So I'd recommend that as a great, and very readable too.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions?
What was the other question that came in? I think we already touched on it.
We've already touched on it in terms of the question of what do you need to disclose to your employer, but can you reiterate a little bit?
What do you need to disclose?
Yeah.
Nothing.
After cancer treatment.
Okay, so I mean the important thing is that people aren't required to say anything, to disclose anything. There is no law that says you must say anything at all. The issue is that the less you say, if you need active support in the form of reasonable adjustments, then the less your employer will do to support you. They're not mind readers.
Yeah.
And if you're going for a job, you don't have to disclose anything. But and your employer should not be asking you questions about your health before they've made a job offer. So that's very important to know. But if you need support and you don't tell an employer, either your current employer or a new employer you need support, they won't give it to you.
I guess also it depends how comfortable you feel and how much you want to disclose, whether you can just say, I have a history of this, or, you know, this happened to me previously, and be quite vague about it, or actually give them your, I guess, life story.
I mean, when I was looking for jobs after when I had cancer, I eventually left after a year and was looking for something else. I wanted to work 4 days a week. I actually was very open about saying I've had cancer, I want to work for 4 days a week because I want to do the other day working in the voluntary sector. And that actually went down pretty well with most employers. They thought, well, that's quite a nice thing to do. But there are some people who don't want to say that, and you're not required to. So it's very much a personal choice. But if for example, you've got mobility problems, or you've got cognitive problems or peripheral neuropathy, and you need adjustments to your workplace, and if you're turning up for an interview and you're clearly slightly disabled, maybe you've got a stick, you know, you can't walk properly, or you need to go to the loo quite a lot. If you try and disguise the reasons as to what's wrong with you, most interviewers will think, hang on, they're not being open with me. You know, people are quite intuitive.
Yeah.
And so if you try and hide things that are clearly affecting you now, then most people will see through that and think, well, they're not being honest, there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And they won't take the interview process any further.
Yeah.
So I think you have to kind of use your common sense.
Yeah.
But if if you're 5 or 6 years post-treatment, you don't need any help, you don't need to say anything.
Yeah, in my previous employment, where I was there for over a year, I was at a point where I had recovered from surgery and didn't at the time need any other treatment, so I felt it was irrelevant really to mention it.
Yeah.
And it's only since I've left that employment, and obviously things have changed for me, that actually they are now aware that that was the case, but the whole time I worked there they didn't know because it wasn't relevant to my situation.
Yeah. And I think it's also perfectly valid, you know, unfortunately some people have a recurrence, you may not have said anything to your employer, and if you have a recurrence, the important thing is then to tell them, because you need that support.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
I think we've got a couple
Got a
more.
few questions.
Okay.
Those who come in, one from Josh. Do you want to go to read it out?
Yeah. As you mentioned, Barbara, I spoke to my employer and was able to reduce my hours on a temporary agreement. I later found out that this also meant that my salary was reflected to the new pro rata rate.
Yes.
Is this normal
It
practice?
is. Well, it's allowable. When you come back on reduced hours, some employers will keep you on full-time pay because that's what they do, and some will adjust your hours or your pay to the hours you're working. Most good HR departments will normally make sure they're paying you at least as much as they would have done under a sick pay arrangement, if you see what I mean. But they're within their rights to pay you for the hours you do.
And I've got a question from Bridget, who would like to know some information on self-employment and cancer.
Yeah. Well, if you're self-employed, you're equally covered by the Equality Act. Even if you're part of a kind of limited company arrangement, you're still covered. So, for example, if you were working for a client who said, well, you've got cancer, and on that basis we're now going to, you can't work with us any longer because we're worried that you're not going to be well enough to continue, that again is direct discrimination, so you could have a case against that particular client. I think it's just important to know your rights. It's again covered in your rights at work, and to be clear with people you're working with, that you know what your situation is and what you can and can't do.
Okay.
Is there any more?
And another question: you've got a book sitting next to you, Barbara? Has that got some information about working with cancer in it?
About my company?
Yes.
No, because my company was set up before this wonderful book was written. But if you go to my website, www.workingwithcancer.co.uk, you can find out more about my organisation.
I think it might be useful because we've got a few more people who've just signed in recently, just to go back to possibly the first 3 or 2 questions, if that's okay.
Yes?
Yeah.
Just because at that time I don't think there was so many people on.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So the first question was, if I'm unable to work, what statutory sick pay or company sick pay is available to me?
Okay, well, as I think we said, there are basically two forms of sick pay. There's company sick pay, which will be written into your contract, if you have a contract. In the current economy, there are lots of people who don't have that luxury. And the other form of sick pay you can claim is statutory sick pay, which is payable normally 4 days after your sickness begins. It's 28 weeks, and it's just over £88 a week. And the rules around payment of sick pay, which I have in front of me here, so I'm going to read them out, are you need to be classed as an employee and have done some work for your employer. You need to have been ill for at least 4 days in a row, including non-working days. You need to have earned at least, I think it's about just over £110 a week before tax. And you need to have told your employer you're sick before any kind of deadlines. So if their rule says you need to let them know within 7 days or something, you should have let them know. But fundamentally, that's for 28 weeks. So even if you're getting company sick pay, and there are lots of rules around company sick pay. Some, don't pay for the first 3 months of your employment and then start it at half pay or whatever. If your company sick pay runs out within that 28 weeks, you're still entitled to claim the statutory sick pay, as it were, for the remainder. So if your company's only paid you 10 weeks sick pay, then you can still get 18 weeks statutory sick pay.
How do I speak to my manager or my boss about my needs to have a phased return to work?
Well, first of all, it's important to talk to your manager, your boss and HR. I think it's quite useful to speak to both of them together. And I think the really important thing is to speak to them about 3 or 4 weeks before you return to work. And that's a kind of proper conversation where you sit down with them and you talk about how you are, whether any further treatment might be necessary once you're back at work, but talking about what hours you think you can manage, whether the job you were doing is still one that you will be able to do immediately at the point of going back. Also, little things like what you want people to know about why you've been off sick. So all those sorts of arrangements. And if people have been covering you while you've been off sick, what's going to happen when you come back?
Okay.
And while we have the time, there are 4 points when people should be having conversations about work. At the point of diagnosis, so the point when you kind of know you've got cancer, at the point you start active treatment, at the point when you're, as I said, 3 or 4 weeks before coming back to work, and then once you're back at work, really every 2 or 3 weeks, I would suggest for up to a year. How's it going? Are the adjustments working? Should we be doing anything differently? It's really, really important. As I say to anybody, over-communicate. So bore people to death, if you want to, with how you are, but under-commit. Don't make promises if you're not sure whether you can fulfil them. So don't say, I'll meet that deadline if you're not sure if you'll be able to do it.
Okay. And the other question was, who do I speak to if my HR department are not being helpful?
Yeah, well, I think the line manager is your best bet. Very often people have a good relationship with their line manager, and that can make all the difference about whether you get back to work successfully. If the line manager, and you don't get on with them or with HR, I'd try the trade union, and if the trade union doesn't work, then I think you probably need to seek a bit of legal advice.
Okay. And just again, do I have to take annual leave to attend appointments?
No. One of the major benefits, or what's the word? One of the things that the Equality Act gives you is the right to have a reasonable adjustments, and one important reasonable adjustment is the right to time off to attend medical appointments. It doesn't have to be paid, but you're within your rights to ask for a longer lunch break or short breaks during the day, or to reduce your hours. They're all perfectly acceptable, reasonable adjustments, and if an employer were to say they can't accommodate them, particularly if it's a large employer, that probably wouldn't be accepted in a court of law, because frankly they should be able to make those small adjustments. Most adjustments cost no money or very little money. With a bit of imagination and creativity, most employers can accommodate people.
Any more questions?
We got any more on Facebook, Joanne?
No, I think that's all we've got now.
Yeah, I think we went through all the questions that we had, right?
Yeah, all the ones that I marked.
Okay. Seems unfortunate. We've got a few people, 10 people signed in.
Okay. Are there any laws that would protect someone returning to work after a brain tumour when some of the capabilities may have changed, physical or cognitive?
So can you repeat that?
Yeah. Are there any laws that would protect someone returning to work after having a brain tumour where some of the capabilities may have changed physically or cognitively?
Yeah, the piece of legislation that protects all cancer survivors, and that includes brain tumours where they're sometimes not classed as cancer, is the Equality Act 2010. I think in Northern Ireland it's still called the Disability Discrimination Act. But that means that an employer is required to make adjustments to support your return to work. And you're protected against 3 forms of discrimination. Direct discrimination, so in other words, somebody says, I'm not employing you because you've got cancer. Indirect discrimination, that's where, for example, an employer says, we're making redundant everyone who's got significant sickness absence this year, and if you've got sickness absence arising from your cancer, to select you would then be an indirect form of discrimination. And then there's something called discrimination arising from disability. So that's where an employer might say, your performance hasn't been very good this year because you've not been able to work the hours you would normally have worked, and on that basis I'm marking your performance down this year and you won't be paid this bonus because of your illness. Well, that's discrimination arising from disability. So you're protected against those 3 forms of discrimination. That protects you in terms of recruitment, promotion, training, pay, anything you can think of in terms of your terms of employment. So there's a lot of protection there. Many employers aren't necessarily fully aware of the Act, so it's always useful bringing it to their attention.
Okay, thank you. Any more, Jamal?
Where would you say you get the best advice in terms of for things like sick pay or for instance help with financial situation?
Okay. If people need any advice on sick pay or benefits, Macmillan have a terrific helpline. If you just ring their helpline, they've got loads of advice, and they give huge amounts of financial information, benefits information every year to people. I think they advise thousands of people. They also have some grants as well that they can provide people who are in particular need. Maggies also have a very good benefits service too. Citizens Advice Bureau are great sources of advice. And there's something called the National Debt Helpline as well. If you go onto my useful links page as well on my website, there are some references there to other.
What's that website?
And the website is www.workingwithcancer.co.uk.
I think there's another one on the Facebook. Do you mind? Lydia. If you refresh it.
2 seconds.
So let's find it. Hold on. If you have a tumour of unknown potential and not technically a diagnosis of cancer, do these laws still cover you?
Interesting point. I think potentially the answer would be probably yes. I would assume so. If it's unknown potential, then I'm sure you'd be covered. If it's a benign tumour, I don't know. I'd need to find out. I'd need to check the answer about that with a lawyer.
Okay.
But if you're basically having tests, and at that stage they're not really aware, or they say you have a tumour but we're not aware, I think potentially you are covered.
Okay. Try any more.
Josh would like to say thank you. This has been very insightful and very helpful.
Good.
And
Let's just stay on line for a second and see if there's any more.
okay. Jolene, can you tell us a little bit about your experience around work?
Yeah, so I now work part-time, but I was in full-time employment for the past sort of 2.5 years up until July, but due to my ongoing chemotherapy, I decided that actually part-time employment was going to be better for me, so I asked for adjustments at work, which happened in July, so I've been working 3 days a week ever since.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue is just recognising what you can do.
Yeah,
And
which
I think
unfortunately isn't full-time.
yeah, but I think one of the things that often happens, particularly with younger people, so it might apply to more to Trekstock kind of age range, is that very often you're really keen to get back to work. You want to prove that you're okay again. You want to get back to normal, and very often people rush back too soon. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't go back to work when you want to go back to work, but the important thing is this is not a kind of, you don't have to prove anything. This is just, the thing to do is to focus on getting well, getting better, and if you can, to take it in smallish steps, rather than saying, I'm fine, and I'm afraid to say guys are rather worse at this, I'm fine, I'll be great, I'll be back to what my hours in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
It takes time. And I think it's much better psychologically to build up gradually than to rush back too quickly and then have to admit not only to yourself but maybe to your boss that you need more time to recover. You kind of think, oh Christ, am I not doing as well as I'd hoped?
Yeah.
So I think it's sometimes just about recognising the reality of your situation.
Yeah.
And not trying to be some kind of superhero.
Yeah.
Nobody has to be a superhero.
No, I tried that, it didn't work.
It didn't work.
So I went back, years ago I went back to work full time and then quite quickly realised that after having brain surgery I had sort of chronic fatigue for about a year, so it probably wasn't a good idea. So then, since then I work part time.
Yeah.
And then eventually went to a full time job many years after that.
Yeah. And there's plenty of time to do other things, or to go back to full time.
Yeah.
Whatever, life is not a straight path. There are lots of twists and turns, and you don't have to accomplish all your dreams in a year.
No. Any more questions?
I had a question. So a close friend of mine has cancer and works in an events company. She's finished her treatment, she's gone back to work, and she feels quite pressurised to do all the things that she used to do, so going to lots of events, drinking a lot, whereas actually now she doesn't want to be doing that. And I wondered what advice I could give to her, because she doesn't feel comfortable to tell her employers.
It's having that conversation. It's really difficult but important. One of the things my company does is we provide people with coaching to have difficult conversations. And I think do they know, the question is, do they know she's had cancer? No.
Not just yet.
Not yet.
No, so she needs to have that conversation.
So, without knowing more, I think the question is, if you need, one of the issues you need to think through is, if you're going to want to change your role, your hours, whatever, is if you know the organisation pretty well, what do you know they can accommodate? If you know they're not going to be able to accommodate the changes you're looking for, then you need to think through, they can't do that commercially. There are sound commercial reasons why they can't do that. Then you need to think about what might be the possible consequences of asking for an adjustment that they could quite reasonably say are not doable. But if you think they can accommodate that adjustment and they like you and they know you well enough that they would want to try and do that, then you should have the conversation. You can't expect people to read your mind.